Before humans, before cities, before history itself, the earth shook under a single step. Not a human stride, not even the tread of an elephant herd, but the slow, crushing descent of a titanosaur's foot into soft, Cretaceous mud. Flesh and bone the size of a small house meet the ground. The impact ripples outward. The forest floor quivers. Dust, leaves, and splinters of bark explode upward in slow motion, hanging in the heavy air like a silent storm. We follow that foot as it pulls free, strings of wet clay stretching and snapping. Insects burst from the undergrowth in frantic clouds. The air is thick and humid, tasting of resin and wet soil. Somewhere far off, thunder mutters over a warm inland sea, almost drowned out by the deep, rolling creak of muscle and tendon. Above us, light fades as a shadow passes over the canopy. It is not a cloud. It is a neck, sweeping overhead, longer than a city bus, moving with impossible grace as it searches the treetops for leaves. This is a world of scale we can barely imagine. We stand in the presence of Argentinosaurus, or Patagotitan, among the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. Their backs rise higher than a two-story building. Their tails stretch out behind them like living bridges. And hidden inside those colossal bodies is the true shock. Some estimates suggest these giants may have rivaled or even exceeded the mass of the heaviest blue whales alive today, while still living on land under full gravity. Here is where the ancient world collides with our understanding of physics. By everything we know about biomechanics and physiology, an animal this massive should be impossible. Its leg bones should shatter like overloaded pillars. Its lungs should struggle to pull in enough air. Its own weight should crush its chest and suffocate it long before it reaches adulthood. And even if it could breathe, how does a heart pump blood up a neck longer than a bus to a brain, swaying high above the ground without failing under its own pressure? Yet the mud holds their footprints. The rocks cradle their bones. These titans did not just exist in theory. They walked, fed, and thrived for millions of years. So what was the secret? How did Earth, physics, and biology conspire to break their own apparent rules and allow such giants to rise? Join us as we step back hundreds of millions of years and follow the clues locked in rock and bone to uncover how a seemingly impossible creature became real. To understand why these animals seem impossible, we first need a benchmark. On our modern Earth, the undisputed champions of sheer mass are blue whales. Not just big whales, but living mountains of flesh and bone. Most adult blue whales that glide through today's oceans weigh somewhere between 70 and 120 metric tons, with only the rarest individuals perhaps pushing toward 150 tons at their absolute peak. That is the scale any land animal must challenge, and that is what makes certain dinosaurs so unsettling. When paleontologists describe Argentinosaurus, they are not speaking of a creature merely longer than a whale. They are describing a sauropod that may have stretched over 30 meters from nose to tail, with hips towering 6 to 7 meters above the ground and mass estimates that often fall in the 60 to 90-ton range. In other words, a land-dwelling herbivore potentially overlapping with the mid-sized blue whales of today. Argentinosaurus is not alone. Patagotitan, another colossal titanosaur from South America, is reconstructed at roughly 30 to 37 meters in length, its shoulders higher than many house roofs, with some studies placing its mass between 55 and 77 tons. Dreadnoughtus, known for more complete remains, appears slightly shorter, around 26 meters long, but massively built, with estimates from about 30 up to over 60 tons. These were the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth, and their size pushes against what we think bone, muscle, and blood can endure. Yet even these numbers are not fixed. They float on layers of uncertainty. We rarely have complete skeletons of these giants. Often we are working from a handful of vertebrae, a femur, or a hip bone. From those fragments, scientists use scaling equations, comparing limb thickness to body mass in living animals. or they build three-dimensional models to estimate body volume. Then add soft tissue that has never been preserved. A little more fat here, a slightly deeper chest there, and the final mass can swing by tens of tons. The result is overlapping ranges where the heaviest sauropods might equal, approach, or fall just short of typical blue whales. But even if we take the conservative view and say these dinosaurs only reach the middle of the blue whale spectrum, the mystery remains. How does a land animal supported by 4 columns of bone even approach 50 or 60 tons without shattering its own skeleton, suffocating under its own weight, or failing to pump blood to a head perched atop a neck longer than a bus? What hidden solutions did evolution discover to keep such a body alive from heartbeat to heartbeat? To answer that, we must step back hundreds of millions of years and set the stage for a world of scale we can barely imagine. Join us as we leave the modern oceans behind, reconstruct vanished ecosystems, and dissect the internal engineering of bones, lungs, and hearts that allowed these giants not just to stand, but to thrive. But once we accept that such bodies existed, a deeper mystery opens in front of us. How did a land animal that massive move at all without shattering its own skeleton? Engineers who study bridges and skyscrapers will tell you that load and support have limits. Yet these giants walked, turned, reared, and left trackways that cross ancient floodplains for kilometers. The first question is brutally simple. How do you keep the legs of a 100-ton animal from snapping? Not just thick bones, but living pillars that grew, repaired themselves, and flexed with every step. Sauropod limb bones had to withstand forces that would crush concrete, yet microscopic studies showed dense internal scaffolding, blended with surprisingly lightweight, air-filled spaces. We are looking at biological architecture pushed to the edge of what Earth's gravity should allow. Then there is the problem of breath. Muscles that large, bodies that long, cannot run on a trickle of oxygen. Mammal-style lungs would have been too inefficient. Evidence locked inside their vertebrae suggests sauropods carried an elaborate system of air sacs, more like modern birds than reptiles or mammals, sweeping fresh air through the lungs in a continuous loop. In some neck bones, up to 60% of the volume is just empty space, carved out for air. How do you balance such extreme lightness with the strength to hold up a neck longer than a school bus? And above those lungs, another puzzle. Blood. To keep a brain perched 8 or 10 meters above the heart alive, the cardiovascular system must generate enormous pressure. Some estimates suggest hearts the size of small cars, pumping against a column of blood that, in a human, would cause vessels to burst. How did evolution discover a way to raise and lower that head without catastrophic failure? Beat after beat, decade after decade, these questions do not exist in isolation. They are tied to the ancient world that shaped these bodies. During much of the Mesozoic era, the continents were arranged differently, the climates were warmer, and atmospheric carbon dioxide was higher than today. Vast conifer forests, fern prairies, and later flowering plants poured energy into the base of the food web. Oxygen and CO2 levels, global temperatures, and rainfall patterns may all have combined to bend the rules of biology, creating a world of scale we can barely imagine. To make sense of this almost alien Earth, paleontologists and biomechanists work like detectives. They read rock layers as case files, each sediment band recording a vanished river, desert, or shoreline. They compare limb bones to living elephants and birds, then feed those measurements into computer models borrowed from aerospace engineering and architecture. They reconstruct lungs, hearts, and muscles that no human has ever seen, testing which designs could stand, walk, and breathe, and which would collapse under their own weight. For us, the stakes go far beyond satisfying curiosity about the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. When we probe the limits of sauropod size, we are probing the outer limits of life itself. How far flesh and bone can be stretched by evolution? How much gravity a skeleton can tolerate? How powerfully a heart can pump? The answers hint at what might be possible on other worlds under different skies, with stronger gravity or thicker air. Yet all of this still leaves one question hanging in front of us. If a land animal could rival or perhaps even surpass a blue whale in mass, what kind of planet allowed it to arise in the first place? To understand that, we must step back hundreds of millions of years beyond familiar continents and oceans to a version of Earth that would be almost unrecognizable from space. From that alien planet, we now return to you, right where you are. Imagine the room around you darkening, the glow of your screen becoming the only light, like the first projector beam cutting through dust in an old theater. The chatter fades, the last footsteps settle, and in that quiet, the entire history of Earth begins to unspool in front of us. Before we step back hundreds of millions of years, pause for a moment and look down at the present. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Are you under bright afternoon sun, or is it past midnight with everyone else asleep? Tell us in the comments, because as you read this, there are thousands of other people scattered across continents, all sharing the same journey through deep time. We are about to trade the human clock for something far older. Minutes and hours will give way to eras and periods. We will start in the Triassic, with small experimental dinosaurs on a hot, recovering planet. We will cross the Jurassic, the golden age of the long-necked giants. We will end in the late Cretaceous, in the shadow of extinction, with some of the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth standing on the brink of oblivion. This is not a quick list of dinosaur facts. It is a slow-burn, cinematic expedition that will set the stage for a world of scale we can barely imagine. Join us as we follow continents as they tear apart, climates as they warm and cool, forests as they rise and fall, and lineages as they adapt, diversify, and sometimes vanish. Geology, biology, and even engineering will interlock into one continuous story about how size itself evolves. Along the way, we will meet the colossal sauropods, whose necks stretched longer than buses, and the massive predators that stalked among them. We will see how air-filled bones, bird-like lungs, and pillar-like limbs allowed them to cheat the normal rules of living on land. We will ask again and again how close they came to the limits of flesh, bone, and blood. So settle in, adjust your screen, dim the lights if you can, and maybe grab a drink or a snack. For the next 2 hours, we invite you to step out of the familiar human timeline and into a 200 million year narrative arc where continents drift like slow storms and a single evolutionary experiment can last longer than all of recorded history. Stay with us to the very end, because there is a verdict waiting there. After we have walked from the first tentative dinosaurs to the last titans of the Cretaceous, we will weigh them against the blue whale and ask one final question. Did any dinosaur truly surpass it? And what would that answer tell us about the ultimate limits of life on Earth? And to weigh that question fairly, we need a moment to breathe. Cut to silence from the narration. Sweeping aerial shots glide over a CGI prehistoric landscape, the camera floating high above endless green floodplains. Below, rivers braid and shimmer in the sun, splitting and rejoining like silver threads across an ancient world. In the distance, thunderheads pile on the horizon, casting drifting shadows over forests of conifers and ferns. A low orchestral theme rises. Strings begin in a quiet tremor, then swell as silhouettes emerge. A line of colossal titanosaurs crossing the floodplain. Their necks sway in slow rhythm, tails trailing like living suspension bridges. Dust curls around pillar-like feet with every step. For a moment, we are simply watching the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth move through their own time, unhurried and immense. The music lifts, brass joining the strings, as the camera drifts closer to one giant. We track along its flank, past skin creased like ancient bark, past ribs arching like the beams of a cathedral. The frame tilts upward, the neck climbs and climbs, vertebra after vertebra, until the top of the animal vanishes into glowing cloud. Over this slow, impossible pan, the title fades in. The dinosaur bigger than a blue whale, and why it shouldn't have been possible. The letters hang against the pale sky while the orchestra reaches its first peak. No words from us. Just music, the hush of wind, and the distant, muffled impact of those massive footsteps. We hold here, letting you feel the scale, letting the grand, documentary-like tone settle in. How could anything this large have ever stood on land at all? The title dissolves, the soundscape softens, the towering sauropod becomes a silhouette, then a shadow, then a shape mapped onto a turning sphere. We fade into a rotating globe of the ancient Earth. Continents are fused into the supercontinent Pangaea, a single vast landmass wrapped by a dark blue ocean. As the orchestral theme thins to softer strings and distant percussion, glowing fracture lines appear, tracing future oceans. The globe slowly spins forward through time. Before your eyes, Pangaea begins to split. First a crack, then widening rifts. Land masses drift apart, pulled into new positions. Shallow seas flood low coasts. Greenbelts expand and contract as climates shift. We step back hundreds of millions of years and watch the Mesozoic era unfold in minutes. Triassic deserts, Jurassic forests, Cretaceous patchworks of island continents. This is our pattern interrupt. To understand one impossible animal, we must first understand an entire changing planet. The camera eases in on the globe as it pauses over what will become South America. The narration returns. To understand the biggest dinosaurs, we must first understand the world that built them. Join us as we set the stage. A warmer Earth, drifting continents and ecosystems tuned to a world of scale we can barely imagine. We step back hundreds of millions of years to an ancient chapter of Earth's story, the Mesozoic era. It spans roughly 252 to 66 million years ago, an immense sweep of time framed by catastrophe at both ends. At its dawn, life is reeling. The Permian-Triassic extinction has just erased around 90% of marine species and a vast share of life on land. Forests thin, ecosystems collapse, and the planet becomes a biological blank slate. Yet in this devastation lies opportunity. New lineages rise to fill empty roles, and among them, quietly at first, are the earliest dinosaurs. This colossal era is divided into three great periods: Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. Each is not just a date on a chart, but a different world, with shifting continents, evolving climates, and new evolutionary experiments. Together, they set the stage for the biggest creatures to ever walk the Earth. The Triassic, from about 252 to 201 million years ago, begins on the supercontinent Pangaea, a single massive landmass ringed by a vast global ocean. Much of the interior is hot, seasonal, even harsh. Early dinosaurs are not yet giants. They are small to medium-sized, lightly built animals, often overshadowed by other reptile groups. Think agile predators and nimble omnivores, not colossal sauropods. Yet in their hollow bones, upright posture, and efficient movement, the blueprint for future giants is already forming. Could anyone in that world have imagined what their descendants would become? Following the Triassic, the Jurassic period, from about 201 to 145 million years ago, sees another extinction event clear away many of the dinosaurs' competitors. The continents begin to rift apart, climates grow more humid in many regions, and lush conifer forests spread. This is often called the golden age of the sauropods. long-necked, long-tailed herbivores such as Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus rise to dominance, some already stretching longer than city buses. Dinosaur diversity explodes, and with it, body size surges upward. The final chapter of the Mesozoic era is the Cretaceous period, lasting from about 145 to 66 million years ago. Continents drift further toward their modern positions. Shallow seas flood interiors, and flowering plants appear, transforming landscapes and food webs. Regional dinosaur faunas emerge: titanosaurs in South America, giant hadrosaurs and ceratopsians in North America and Asia, unique lineages in Africa and Europe. Here, in this complex fragmented world, dinosaurs reach their absolute size extremes, including the titanic sauropods that may have rivaled or exceeded the heaviest blue whales. The macro arc is stark. From the ashes of the Permian extinction, dinosaurs rise small and modest, grow into global giants, then vanish abruptly in the end, Cretaceous impact that ends their reign. Join us as we follow that arc, because the Mesozoic was not a single static dinosaur world, but a long, dynamic laboratory. Over 186 million years, climate, vegetation, and anatomy slowly assembled the conditions that made true land-dwelling giants possible and set the stage for one almost impossible animal. To understand that almost impossible animal, we have to step back hundreds of millions of years and look at the world it walked through. This was not our ice-capped planet with sharp seasons and frozen poles. The Mesozoic era unfolded on a warmer, stranger Earth. For most of the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, global temperatures were higher than today, not just in the tropics, but almost everywhere. Geological evidence from fossilized soils to the chemistry of ancient shells shows little to no permanent polar ice. Even high latitudes hosted forests, with ginkgos and conifers growing where modern tundra now lies. Winters were cooler, but truly freezing conditions were rare. Imagine a world where frost is exceptional, not routine, and growing seasons stretch long across vast continents. In that greenhouse world, the air itself was different. Carbon dioxide levels were often several times higher than today, trapping more heat and supercharging photosynthesis. At certain times, oxygen may also have been slightly elevated, based on bubbles in ancient salt crystals and the chemistry of iron-rich rocks. More CO2 means plants can grow faster and pack more biomass into the same area. More oxygen can expand the metabolic envelope for active animals. Together, they hint at an atmosphere that quietly subsidized both forests and the creatures that fed on them. Join us as we follow that subsidy down to the ground. Lush fern prairies, towering conifer stands, and later, early flowering plants spread across whole regions, forming nearly continuous carpets and canopies of food. Instead of patchy seasonal resources, many dinosaur ecosystems had relatively stable year-round plant production. For a massive herbivore, that stability is everything. A giant body is a constant demand for energy. A giant landscape of greenery can, in principle, meet it. At the same time, the continents themselves were on the move. Early in the Mesozoic, most land was fused into Pangaea, a supercontinent that stretched almost from pole to pole. As we move into the Jurassic and Cretaceous, Pangaea rifted apart. This breakup created long, ragged coastlines, broad continental shelves, and shallow inland seas that moderated climate and brought moist air far inland. Where there had been arid interiors, new coastal plains and river systems appeared, each supporting its own regional dinosaur communities. This shifting geography did more than redraw maps. It multiplied habitats: warm, humid basins, seasonal floodplains, coastal swamps, upland conifer forests. Such diversity allowed large herbivore populations to spread out rather than strip any one area bare. Environment became engineer. Climate, atmosphere, and moving plates together set the stage for a world of scale we can barely imagine. A world where colossal plant eaters could, in theory, be sustained. But here's the twist. When dinosaurs first appear in the late Triassic, they are not the biggest creatures to ever walk the Earth. They are small, lightly built, often no larger than a large dog or a human. The planet was primed for giants long before giants arrived. How then did these modest animals tap into that planetary subsidy and push body size to the edge of what biology allows? To find the answer, we have to step back hundreds of millions of years to a world that almost ended. Before there were colossal sauropods, before even the first true dinosaurs, Earth passed through the greatest extinction in its history. At the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods, around 252 million years ago, something went catastrophically wrong. Massive volcanic eruptions, climate chaos, and collapsing food webs triggered the Permian-Triassic extinction. Up to 90% of marine species vanished. On land, forests withered, whole groups of animals disappeared, and ecosystems were stripped down to their bare framework. The age of reptiles began not with abundance, but with emptiness. That emptiness mattered. With so many niches suddenly vacant, the Triassic became an evolutionary laboratory. This was a harsh, seasonal world. Vast supercontinent deserts in the interior of Pangaea, monsoon belts along the coasts, and extreme swings between wet and dry. Strange archosaurs with armored backs and crocodile-like snouts prowled river margins. Tiny, shrew-like early mammals hid in burrows and leaf litter. In this recovering ancient world, no single group yet ruled the land. Into this unstable stage stepped the first proto-dinosaurs. They were not giants. They were survivors. Lightly built, fast, and opportunistic, they threaded their way between larger predators and bulky herbivores that still traced their ancestry to pre-extinction faunas. Join us as we watch evolution work with small bodies and simple designs long before it attempts a world of scale we can barely imagine. Early in the late Triassic, in what is now South America, we meet creatures like Eoraptor. It stood only about as tall as a medium dog, weighing perhaps 10 kilograms, with a slender body, grasping hands, and teeth suited to an omnivorous diet. Slightly later, Herrerasaurus appears, longer and more powerfully built, but still modest beside the giants to come, roughly human length from snout to tail. These were experiments in posture, speed, and weaponry, not yet the biggest creatures to ever walk the Earth. Their bodies carried clues. Upright, pillar-like hind limbs replaced the sprawling gait of earlier reptiles, allowing efficient, long-distance movement. Hips and ankles stiffened into stable, load-bearing joints. Their chests and vertebrae began to house more complex air sacs and lungs, early versions of the unidirectional airflow that would later power massive sauropod bodies. Gigantism did not appear overnight. It took tens of millions of years of evolutionary tinkering, incremental changes in growth rates, bone structure, and respiratory efficiency, before any dinosaur could safely pile dozens of tons of flesh onto a skeleton. Why does this slow, patient buildup matter? Because somewhere inside, these small, fast hunters and omnivores lay the genetic toolkit that would one day assemble a creature heavier than a modern jetliner. The Triassic did not yet host those giants, but it set the stage for them. As climates stabilized and plant communities recovered, the descendants of these early dinosaurs were poised to seize new opportunities. In the next period, that latent potential would explode into true titans. That latent potential did not leap straight to creatures heavier than jetliners. First, evolution took smaller, careful steps. Before the truly colossal sauropods, the Triassic and earliest Jurassic were ruled by what we might call the first experiments in largeness. When we step back hundreds of millions of years into this turbulent era, we do not yet see the biggest creatures to ever walk the Earth. We see medium giants, animals like Plateosaurus in Europe or Riojasaurus in South America, stretching 6 to 9 meters in length and weighing as much as a modern rhinoceros. Impressive, yes, but still far from the 70-ton titans that would one day challenge the blue whale's crown. These early archosaurs and protosauropodomorphs had already broken away from the classic reptilian image. Instead of sprawling like lizards, many carried their limbs directly beneath the body. This erect, pillar-like posture was a quiet revolution. When your legs are vertical columns rather than splayed supports, each step costs less energy, joints experience less twisting force, and the skeleton can safely bear more mass. Engineers scaling up an animal from dog size to elephant size would predict exactly this change. Join us as we imagine those first herds moving across Pangaea. Their backbones still low, their necks only modestly lengthened, their tails used for balance rather than as vast counterweights. They were stretching the familiar rules of anatomy, not rewriting them. Their bones were solid, not yet riddled with the extensive air sacs that would later hollow out sauropod skeletons. Their lungs were efficient for reptiles, but not yet the fully bird-like breathing systems that powered later giants. Why did evolution pause here at large instead of racing straight to colossal? Part of the answer lies in the world they inhabited. The Triassic period followed Earth's greatest mass extinction, and its ecosystems were still unstable. Harsh seasonal swings, intense monsoons, and long dry spells meant that plant growth could be boom and bust. Forests were dominated by conifers, seed ferns, and other ancient lineages, with limited diversity and patchy productivity. For a giant herbivore, that meant risk. If your body demands a constant flood of food, can you afford years when drought shrinks the forests? In this context, Triassic giants remained within what our engineering intuition would expect from simply scaling up large mammals or reptiles. No exotic physics, no impossible stresses. Their hearts did not need to push blood up necks longer than buses, and their leg bones did not yet flirt with the limits of compression. But this was only a prelude. As the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic, climates would stabilize, plant communities would explode in abundance, and a new body plan would appear. In the next period, long necks, air-filled bones, and supercharged lungs would combine, and size would surge past the old rules into a world of scale we can barely imagine. But before we follow that surge, step by step, we break the timeline. In an instant, the modest Triassic forms around us dissolve. Forests thicken, conifers tower, and the air seems heavier with life. We stand now in the Jurassic, or perhaps the early Cretaceous, in front of one of the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. Its shadow passes over us before we even see its head. Look up. Higher than the tree canopy, higher than any giraffe could dream, a neck rises like a living crane. It keeps rising. Segment after segment of vertebrae, each one a massive block of bone, stack into the sky until the skull disappears into a band of low cloud. This is a fully evolved giant sauropod, a living skyscraper rooted in an ancient world. Its neck alone is longer than a city bus, sweeping in a slow arc over the forest. Its body, from small efficient head to the base of its tail, stretches to the length of a commercial airplane. The entire animal weighs as much as dozens of elephants pressed into a single colossal frame, a walking mass that should, by all our everyday experience, be impossible. Join us as we pause and really feel what that means. A heart, perhaps the size of a compact car, must drive blood up that impossible neck, fighting gravity every meter of the way. How do you keep pressure high enough to feed the brain without bursting vessels in the chest? How does a column of muscle, bone, and air-filled chambers hold steady when a gust of wind pushes against a head 10 meters above the treetops? From the side, the problems multiply. If this animal had to move its entire body every time it wanted to feed, it would waste vast amounts of energy just walking from tree to tree. Instead, the neck itself becomes a feeding machine, sweeping across a wide circle of foliage while the pillar-like legs remain almost still. But how do you design a neck that long, that light, and that strong without snapping it like an overloaded crane? Engineers, biologists, and paleontologists all look at this silhouette and see a list of contradictions. Bone must be strong, yet not crushingly heavy. Lungs must be powerful, yet efficient enough to oxygenate such a vast body. The skull must guide that enormous neck, yet stay small to keep the lever light. Every part of this animal is an answer to an engineering nightmare. We will return to those answers. In later sections, we will peel back the skin of this giant, follow the blood to its brain, trace the air through its lungs, and see how air-filled bones and bird-like breathing set the stage for such extremes. For now, fix this image in your mind. A neck in the clouds, a body like an aircraft, a land-bound titan that makes the blue whale's support from the ocean seem almost like cheating. This is the final form we are explaining. Now we step back hundreds of millions of years again and watch how evolution climbed toward it, one small, improbable change at a time. To see how that neck in the clouds became possible, we have to visit a different age of giants, not the final titans of the Cretaceous, but their architects, their blueprint. Following the Triassic, the Jurassic period spanned from about 201 million years ago to 145 million years ago. This era unfolded on a warm, humid Earth with no polar ice caps, high sea levels, and thick belts of forest stretching across continents. Seasons were gentle, ecosystems were relatively stable, and for tens of millions of years, plant growth outpaced anything we see on land today. Join us as we step back hundreds of millions of years into this greenhouse world, where the classic long-necked dinosaurs first took over. This was the golden age of the sauropods, the long-necked, long-tailed, four-legged herbivores that would become some of the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. Not just one kind of giant, but many. Diplodocus, with its extraordinary whip-like tail and low horizontal neck, swept through vegetation like a living crane. Apatosaurus, stockier and more muscular, carried a similar low-browsing posture but with heavier bones and a deeper chest. In contrast, Brachiosaurus raised its shoulders high, its forelimbs longer than its hind limbs, holding its neck like a living tower to feed from the forest canopy. The same basic body plan, three very different ways of using it. These contrasts were not cosmetic. They were ecological strategies. Diplodocus and its relatives likely specialized in mid-level vegetation, stripping leaves from conifer branches and horsetails along river plains. Apatosaurus may have focused on tougher plants closer to the ground, using its robust frame to bulldoze through dense growth. Brachiosaurus and its kin, by lifting their heads several stories high, tapped into leaves no other herbivore could reach. Different neck postures, different tooth shapes, and different feeding heights allowed multiple colossal species to share the same landscapes without starving each other. How else could so many massive bodies coexist? The landscape itself made this possible. Jurassic continents, still closer together than in the Cretaceous, were draped in vast conifer forests, with towering araucarias, dense stands of cycads, and carpets of ferns and horsetails along wetlands and floodplains. These plants grew year-round in many regions, providing a continuous, high biomass food source. Imagine hillsides where almost every surface is green, and every season is growing season. In such an ancient world, a herd of 30-ton animals was not an exception. It was part of the normal ecological machinery. By the late Jurassic, sauropods had already pushed body size far beyond any land mammal alive today. Some species exceeded 30 meters in length and masses of 30 to 40 tons. Yet as colossal as they were, they still fell short of the most extreme titanosaurs that would appear later. The Jurassic perfected the sauropod blueprint: air-filled bones, efficient lungs, long necks, and pillar limbs all honed in this stable period. The Cretaceous would take that perfected design and set the stage for a world of scale we can barely imagine. What happens when that blueprint meets shifting continents, new plants, and a changing sky? To answer that, we need to look closely at the giants that came first. Before the most extreme titanosaurs, Jurassic sauropods had already solved the fundamental engineering problem of being massive on land. They were not experiments anymore. They were finished blueprints. When we step back hundreds of millions of years into the Jurassic, we find bodies built like moving architecture. Sauropod limbs were not sprawled out like a lizard's. They dropped straight down from the hips and shoulders, forming columnar legs arranged directly under the torso, like the pillars of a temple holding up a stone roof. This posture turned bone and cartilage into load-bearing columns, channeling weight straight into the ground and minimizing bending forces that would snap a more horizontal limb. It is the same principle that lets skyscrapers stand tall without folding under their own weight. Those pillars carried a torso that did something extraordinary with the neck. Instead of a heavy skull balanced at the end of a short spine, Jurassic sauropods carried small, lightweight heads on astonishingly long necks. The head was little more than a cropping tool. Teeth, nostrils, eyes, and not much else. By stripping mass away from the skull, they reduced torque at the base of the neck, the twisting force that rises dramatically as you add weight farther from the body. This meant a brachiosaurus could sweep a feeding envelope many meters high and wide without marching its enormous body from tree to tree. Why move 70 tons of torso when you can move a few hundred kilograms of neck? Inside those necks and backs, the engineering becomes even more radical. The vertebrae of many Jurassic sauropods were not solid blocks of bone. They were pneumatic, riddled with chambers and hollowed spaces invaded by air sacs, sometimes making them more than half air by volume. To a human engineer, they look like natural trusses, light but strong, turning what could have been crushing dead weight into a relatively low-mass framework capable of supporting colossal bodies. These airspaces were not isolated tricks. They were part of a likely bird-like respiratory system. Instead of lungs that simply inflate and deflate, sauropods probably had unidirectional airflow, where fresh air moves in a loop through rigid lungs, pushed by a series of air sacs in the neck, chest, and even the abdomen. This system, which modern birds use, extracts oxygen far more efficiently than our own. For creatures with hearts pumping blood through necks longer than buses, such efficiency was not a luxury. It was survival. Put together, these Jurassic sauropods represent a fully functional giant animal design: pillar limbs, light heads, air-filled bones, and high-performance lungs working as one. Join us as we follow this perfected blueprint into the Cretaceous, where titanosaurs would take every one of these solutions and set the stage for a world of scale we can barely imagine. How far can you stretch a successful design before physics finally says no? To see how far that design could be stretched, we have to change not the animal first, but the world around it. We step back hundreds of millions of years to the final act of the Mesozoic era, the Cretaceous period. The Cretaceous lasted from about 145 million years ago to 66 million years ago. In that span of deep time, the continents we know were still drifting toward their modern positions. The single supercontinent of Pangaea was long gone. Instead, great landmasses were breaking apart, separated by widening oceans and vast, shallow seas that flooded continental interiors. South America, in particular, was becoming increasingly isolated, a gigantic warm island continent where many of the largest titanosaurs we know, Argentinosaurus, Patagodon, Dreadnoughtus, would evolve. This was not a world of ice caps and sharp seasons. Global temperatures were warmer than today, and sea levels were higher, drowning coastal margins under broad, shallow seas. Where land met water, immense coastal plains and river-fed floodplains spread out for hundreds of kilometers. These were not empty spaces. They were carpeted with vegetation, crisscrossed by meandering rivers, and renewed again and again by flooding that laid down fresh sediments and nutrients. For a massive plant-eating giant, this was paradise. Imagine herds of colossal sauropods moving across these low, flat landscapes, always within reach of water, always within reach of plants. High sea levels meant more humid interiors and fewer deserts, smoothing out the extremes. When the land is gently fertile instead of harsh and patchy, large herbivores can travel in groups, graze or browse almost continuously, and still find enough food. In such an ancient world, the land itself set the stage for the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. At the same time, the plant world was undergoing a quiet revolution. Traditional gymnosperm forests of conifers, cycads, and ginkgos still dominated many regions, but a new kind of plant was spreading, flowering plants or angiosperms. These plants grew fast, reproduced quickly, and came in an astonishing variety of forms, from low shrubs and ground cover to early flowering trees. More plant types meant more ways to harvest sunlight, more leaves, more seeds, more fruit. Could this botanical diversification have offered year-round food and higher quality forage for giant herbivores? Ecologists today know that stable, productive ecosystems can support more total biomass at every level of the food web. When primary productivity is high and relatively steady, it becomes possible to maintain not just more animals, but bigger ones. Creatures that must eat almost constantly just to stay alive. In the Cretaceous, warmth, high sea levels, and diverse plant communities combined into a kind of planetary supercharging. In this supercharged world, one lineage of sauropods seized the opportunity. Join us as we follow the titanosaurs, a group that would take the sauropod blueprint and push body size into territory that makes not only biologists, but engineers deeply nervous. How close did they come to the absolute limits of life on land? In the late Cretaceous, that nervous engineering experiment had a name: titanosaurs. When we talk about the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth, we are, more often than not, talking about them. Titanosaurs were not a single giant species, but an entire branch on the sauropod family tree, a clade that diversified and spread until they dominated many Cretaceous ecosystems. As the continents drifted toward their modern positions, these giants appeared across South America, Africa, India, Madagascar, and parts of Asia, turning whole regions into landscapes shaped by their feeding, their migrations, and their sheer weight pressing into the soil. Their basic body plan followed the sauropod blueprint, but with a distinctive twist. They carried massive torsos on column-like limbs, yet many adopted a wide-gauge stance, their legs splayed slightly farther apart, like living suspension bridges stabilizing a moving skyscraper. Their necks could be extremely long, sweeping through layered canopies of conifers and flowering plants, while their tails stretched behind them as dynamic counterweights, sometimes as long as the rest of the body combined. In some species, bony plates called osteoderms studded the skin, forming patches of armor that turned already colossal herbivores into heavily fortified ones. This was a world of scale we can barely imagine. Herds of titanosaurs in Cretaceous South America may have included individuals rivaling small buildings in height, moving through fern plains and forests of Araucaria. Join us as we picture their silhouettes against warm Cretaceous skies, their footsteps leaving craters that could fill with water and become temporary ponds for smaller animals. Within this lineage lie the current contenders for the title of heaviest land animal in Earth's history. Argentinosaurus, known from Argentina, Patagoteton from Patagonia, and Dreadnoughtus from southern South America all push mass estimates into the tens of tons, with some calculations suggesting 60, 70, or even more metric tons. Each is known from incomplete remains, yet their limb bones and vertebrae are so large that even conservative reconstructions place them beyond anything living on land today. When we ask which dinosaur came closest to, or perhaps even overlapped with, the great blue whale in sheer mass, we are really asking which titanosaur pushed this body plan the farthest. Remarkably, titanosaurs did not vanish midway through the Cretaceous. They persisted right up to the end of the period, surviving alongside evolving packs of large theropod predators and through sweeping changes in plant communities as flowering plants spread and diversified. While other sauropod groups declined or disappeared, titanosaurs adapted, radiated, and held on until the final extinction event 66 million years ago. To understand how one of these landbound giants might have rivaled a blue whale, we now need to zoom in. How do we reconstruct such incomplete skeletons? How do we weigh something that has been stone for tens of millions of years? In the next section, we will follow Argentinosaurus, Patagotitan, Dreadnoughtus, and their relatives, and see how a few enormous bones have rewritten the upper limits of terrestrial size and set the stage for one of the greatest scientific debates in dinosaur paleontology. To answer those questions, we follow the trail of one of the most elusive giants ever found. Not a complete skeleton laid out in the rock, but a scattered echo of something colossal. Argentinosaurus huinculensis. In the early 1980s, near the town of Plaza Huincul in Patagonia, a rancher noticed strange blocks of stone weathering out of a hillside. These were not ordinary rocks. When paleontologists arrived, they realized they were looking at vertebrae and limb bones so massive they dwarfed any known land animal. In this quiet corner of South America, we suddenly met a candidate for the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. Before humans, before cities, before history itself, this region was a warm, seasonal floodplain, crisscrossed by rivers and dotted with conifer forests. Here, during the late Cretaceous period, Argentinosaurus moved through an ancient world built for giants. The bones that remained were few, but each one was a revelation. A single back vertebra rose over a meter from base to spine, as tall as a child. Segments of ribs curved longer than most people are tall. The femur, reconstructed from fragments, would have been thicker than a human torso and heavy enough that several adults would struggle even to shift it. From such fragments, how do we reach an entire animal? Join us as we step back hundreds of millions of years in our minds and use better-known sauropods as our measuring sticks. Paleontologists compare Argentinosaurus's surviving vertebrae and limb bones with more complete titanosaurs and classic giants like Brachiosaurus. By scaling up their proportions, they estimate a body stretching perhaps 30 to 35 meters from nose to tail tip, with a mass in the range of 70 to 90 metric tons, and some models even higher. This is a world of scale we can barely imagine. A land animal approaching and possibly overlapping the heft of all but the very heaviest blue whales. Yet Argentinosaurus remains a phantom. No skull has been found. Much of the neck, tail, and shoulder girdle are missing. Was it relatively long-bodied, like Diplodocus, or more compact and deep-chested, like some other titanosaurs? Small changes in torso width, neck thickness, or tail length can swing mass estimates by tens of tons. At what point do we cross the line from plausible biology into a creature that would snap its own legs with every step? Some researchers argue that the highest figures push against biomechanical limits for bone strength, circulation, and muscle power. Others counter that sauropods evolved extraordinary weight-saving adaptations and that our intuitions, shaped by modern mammals, underestimate what their bodies could endure. For now, Argentinosaurus stands as a ghostly upper bound, a colossal outline drawn from a handful of stone. And if this giant is only a silhouette, what happens when we discover a similar titan preserved in far greater detail? In the next section, we meet Patagotitan, a Cretaceous colossus that lets us see, almost bone by bone, how a near whale-sized land animal was actually built. Now with Patagotitan, that outline suddenly gains bones, joints, and measurable weight. We move from a ghostly sketch to a nearly complete frame of one of the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. In the early 2010s, on a windswept ranch in Patagonia, workers stumbled on something impossible to ignore: a gigantic femur over 2 meters long, lying in the ancient rock. That bone led to more, and then to many more. As paleontologists carefully excavated the site, they realized they were not uncovering a single individual, but the overlapping remains of at least half a dozen colossal titanosaurs. Together, those skeletons would be named Patagotitan majorum, the Patagonian giant, a Cretaceous colossus preserved in extraordinary detail. Before humans, before cities, before history itself, this region was a flat, river-laced floodplain where herds of these giants moved across the landscape. Not just big animals, but true titans. Neck vertebrae as long as a person is tall. Tailbones stacked into a whip that could stretch across a town street. For the first time at this extreme size, we are not guessing from a handful of fragments. We are tracing a body plan almost bone by bone. Museum reconstructions of Patagotitan now fill entire exhibition halls. You walk in, and the skeleton does not simply stand in the room. It defines the room. The head hovers above balcony level. The torso stretches the length of a tennis court. A single forelimb, planted like a stone column, dwarfs the people clustered at its base. This is a world of scale we can barely imagine made suddenly, almost uncomfortably, real. From these mounts and the original fossils, scientists estimate Patagotitan's mass in the range of roughly 60 to over 70 metric tons, overlapping the lower to mid-range of blue whale masses. Some whales exceed that, but remember, they are buoyed by water. Patagotitan carried a comparable load on dry land, on 4 living pillars of bone and muscle. How close does that bring us to the physical limits of what a terrestrial skeleton can bear? Because we have so many bones from multiple individuals, we can do more than quote a number. We can examine how thick its leg bones were, how widely the joint surfaces spread the load, how the limb proportions changed from juvenile to adult. We can trace the chain of vertebrae along the spine and see where the backbone was lightened by air spaces and where it was reinforced, hinting at how the neck and tail balanced and how the torso carried the weight of a vast gut. Join us as we push beyond simple length and height into living function. With Patagotitan, we can finally start to ask detailed questions. How strong did its spine need to be to support that massive body? How did its lungs and bird-like air sacs move enough oxygen through such a volume of flesh? What kind of heart could drive blood through a circulatory system measured in tens of meters? In the next section, we test these questions against the hard rules of biology and physics and ask whether a creature like this should have been possible at all. To test those questions, we need a dinosaur we can actually measure. Not a handful of ribs or a single limb bone, but a giant preserved in enough detail that we can treat it almost like a machine. That is where Dreadnoughtus schranni strides onto the stage. Discovered in the rocks of Patagonia and dating to the late Cretaceous period, Dreadnoughtus is one of the best preserved colossal titanosaurs ever found. More than 70% of its postcranial skeleton is known. Neck, shoulders, hips, limbs, and tail, laid out like the blueprint of a living crane. In a world where many of the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth are known from scattered fragments, this level of completeness is extraordinary. It lets us move beyond guesswork and into testable models. Its name means fears nothing, a fitting title for an animal that, in life, would have towered over almost any predator. Early reconstructions suggested a mass of around 60 tons, putting it in the same league as the largest blue whales. That estimate came from scaling relationships between limb bone thickness and body weight, a method widely used in paleontology. But as more conservative biomechanical models were applied, some researchers argued for lower values, perhaps closer to 30 or 40 tons. The skeleton did not change. Our assumptions did. Join us as we look at how those assumptions are tested. Engineers and paleontologists take the fossil bones of Dreadnoughtus and scan them into 3 dimensions, building a digital body around its ancient frame. They wrap virtual muscles around its hips and shoulders, estimate the volume of its torso and tail, and assign realistic densities to different tissues. Then they let the model move. Step by step, they simulate walking, turning, and even how far the neck could safely reach without overloading the spine. Through this process, Dreadnoughtus becomes more than a museum mount. It becomes a subject in a virtual laboratory where researchers can change the thickness of its soft tissues, alter its posture, or shift its center of mass, and watch how those choices affect stress on the limbs and the energy needed to move. Yet even with such good material, mass estimates still vary widely. A slightly deeper chest, a more muscular tail, a thicker layer of fat, and the total climbs by many tons. A leaner, narrower body, and it falls again. So, we arrive at an unsettling realization. If one of our best-known giants can swing from perhaps 30 to over 50 tons on paper, what does that say about the true limits of size on land? At what point does physics simply say no, no matter how clever evolution is? In the next section, we step back from individual skeletons and ask where the hard boundary lies for any animal that must stand, breathe, and walk on the solid earth. To find that boundary, we have to leave individual dinosaurs behind and look at the rules that govern everybody on Earth. This is where the story shifts from bones in rock to numbers on paper, and those numbers are surprisingly unforgiving. When an animal scales up, its size does not grow in a simple one-to-one way. If we double an animal's length, we do not just get a creature that is twice as big. We enter a world of scale we can barely imagine. Length doubles, width doubles, height doubles, volume, and therefore mass, explodes with the cube of that change. 2 times longer becomes 8 times heavier. But the cross-sectional area of its bones and muscles, the thickness of the columns holding it up, only grows with the square. Imagine a small model of an elephant made perfectly of the same material. Make it twice as tall, keeping everything in proportion. Its leg bones are now 4 times as thick in cross-section, but they must carry 8 times the weight. Each square centimeter of bone feels twice the stress. Push that scaling further, and at some point, the bones of your perfectly scaled giant would snap under its own mass, even before it takes a step. Real evolution cannot afford that. To keep stress within safe limits, large animals must cheat simple geometric scaling. Their bones become disproportionately thicker, their joints more buttressed, their limb muscles arranged to shorten lever arms and reduce bending. Instead of the bent, springy legs of a gazelle, they adopt straighter, pillar-like postures, stacking bone directly under bone so that weight travels as compression rather than as a bending force. We see this clearly in the largest land mammals alive today. Elephants carry their massive bodies on thick, columnar limbs, with relatively straight knees and ankles, and a slow, deliberate gait. They are already pushing against the upper limits of a typical mammalian design, where lungs, circulation, and bone all scaled up from much smaller ancestors. Join us as we compare them to sauropods. Even the heaviest elephant, at around 6 or 7 tons, is a lightweight next to a 30, 40, or perhaps 70-ton dinosaur. Step back hundreds of millions of years, and the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth had to solve the same brutal equations. Their legs still dealt with cubes of mass on squares of bone. Their vertebrae still had to resist bending and buckling. By the math alone, a land animal creeping toward blue whale mass should stand on the brink of structural failure, every step a calculated risk. So how did sauropods, with necks longer than buses and bodies like moving hillsides, not only stand, but thrive for over 100 million years? In the next section, we set the stage for the anatomical tricks that let these giants bend and sometimes rewrite the rules of scaling. To answer that, we have to look down, past the necks and barrel bodies, to the foundations. Before muscles, before lungs, before hearts the size of small cars, sauropods solved a more basic problem. How do you keep a living hillside from collapsing under its own weight? They did it by turning their legs into architecture. Sauropod limbs were not splayed out to the sides like a lizard's, and not deeply bent like those of a galloping mammal. Instead, the humerus and femur stood almost straight, near vertical columns locked directly beneath the body, the way the main supports of a skyscraper are stacked in line with the floors above. Weight did not travel through twisting angles. It flowed straight down from spine to hip and shoulder into those colossal shafts of bone and then into the ground. This posture meant bone was used in the way it is strongest, in compression rather than in bending. Join us as we picture Argentinosaurus, its shoulders and hips towering above the ground, each forelimb and hind limb planted like a massive concrete pillar. The joints were tucked close to the body, not flared outward, so that every ton of mass pressed almost perfectly along the length of the limb. For the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth, even a few degrees of extra bend could have meant structural failure. Many titanosaurs went one step further. Their trackways show a wide-gauge stance, with footprints set farther from the body midline than in earlier sauropods. Instead of walking along a tightrope, they moved on a broad walkway. By spreading the limbs outward slightly, they widened their base of support, lowering the risk of toppling and distributing weight over a larger area of ground. In a world of scale we can barely imagine, even stability becomes a critical resource. The bones themselves were overbuilt for the task. Sauropod limb bones were thick, with dense shafts and greatly expanded ends where they met the shoulder, hip, knee, and ankle. Those enlarged joint surfaces acted like oversized load-bearing pads, spreading forces over a greater area of cartilage and bone, reducing stress at any single point. When an animal masses 50, 70, or perhaps even 90 tons, every square centimeter of contact matters. Contrast this with us and with other mammals. Our limbs are more flexed, the joints bent like springs under the body. This crouched posture is excellent for speed, agility, and rapid acceleration. It allows cheetahs to sprint and antelopes to leap, but bent limbs turn bones into levers, demanding large muscles and high forces to keep the body from sagging. For extreme, static loads, it is a poor solution. Sauropods traded speed for support. They became walking colonnades, living frameworks of vertical struts and broad joints. Yet even perfect pillars are not enough. A giant still has to move those columns, fill that immense chest with air, and drive blood up a neck longer than a bus. How do you keep such a structure alive in motion? That is the next engineering problem we must solve. To answer it, we have to leave bones and beams behind for a moment and listen for something softer. Not the creak of joints, but the slow, heavy rhythm of a colossal heartbeat. Imagine you are standing in a quiet hall, and in front of you is a heart the size of a small car. Its walls are as thick as your arm. Each beat does not flutter, it thuds. The whole floor seems to pulse with it, a deep, deliberate surge of fluid power. This is the kind of engine the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth may have carried in their chests. We are used to thinking about skeletons when we picture giants, yet a skeleton is only scaffolding. To keep a sauropod alive, blood had to be pushed through tens of meters of vessels, up and down a neck, perhaps 9 to 12 meters long, against gravity that never rested. In your own body, your heart works at a pressure of roughly 120/80. It feels ordinary. It is not. Now consider a giraffe. Its brain sits only a few meters above its heart, yet it already needs a specialized high-pressure system. Thick-walled arteries, tight skin, and intricate valves to keep blood from rushing down and pooling in its legs every time it lowers its head. Even with these adaptations, a giraffe's heart is massive for its size, and its blood pressure is more than twice that of a human. Stretch that problem out along a sauropod neck, and we enter a world of scale we can barely imagine. To lift blood to a skull perched high over the Jurassic canopy, some models suggest pressures that would make human vessels burst instantly. So how did these animals avoid shredding their own circulatory systems? How did a car-sized heart beat for decades without tearing itself apart, while still bathing a distant brain in oxygen with every stroke? This is our pattern break. For a moment, forget mass estimates and limb bones. Picture those arteries as thick as hoses, buried deep within an ancient body, pulsing steadily as the animal walks. Did sauropods keep their heads lower than we once thought, easing the height problem? Did they use multiple booster pumps along the neck, or networks of elastic vessels and reservoirs to smooth out each surge? Join us as we hold those questions in our minds, because they set the stage for a different kind of engineering challenge. We have been following how these giants supported their bulk, how their pillars met the ground. But a moving structure is also a breathing, circulating one. Before we dive fully into lungs, air sacs, and the strange inner architecture that let sauropods cheat the usual rules of size, we must finish the mechanical story of motion. How muscles, joints, and strides carried that living tower of blood and bone across the ancient Earth. Motion for these giants was never casual. Every step was a negotiation with gravity, a quiet calculation of balance, force, and risk on a world of scale we can barely imagine. Computer simulations, built from digital skeletons and layered with muscles, tendons, and estimated masses, suggest that the biggest sauropods walked with a slow, deliberate gait, not a gallop, not even a trot. A measured 4-beat walk in which at least 3 feet were almost always in contact with the ground. When we match those models to real trackways, broad parallel rows of circular footprints pressed deep into ancient riverbeds, we see the same pattern. Wide, regular spacing, no sign of running, and a rhythm that prioritizes stability over speed. Why such caution? On land, a body weighing 50, 70, perhaps even 80 metric tons lives on the edge of what bone and muscle can safely support. A fall from even a few meters of hip height would mean catastrophic forces on ribs, hips, and the spine. For the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth, a misstep was not a minor accident. It could be a one-way path to extinction for the individual, and over evolutionary time, for any lineage that moved too recklessly. To avoid that fate, sauropods relied on a 4-legged wide stance posture that kept their center of mass safely caged within a stable base. Imagine connecting the footprints of a walking Argentinosaurus with lines. You form a shifting 4-sided shape on the ground, a support polygon. As long as the animal's center of mass stayed above that polygon, it did not tip. Their columnar limbs splayed just enough to widen that polygon, and their sweeping, counterbalancing tails worked together to keep that invisible point of balance securely inside its moving frame. This is why the simulations, the trackways, and comparisons with modern animals converge on the same answer. These were not sprinters. Their top speeds likely matched or fell below those of elephants today, perhaps 10 to 20 kilometers per hour at most, with a comfortable pace far slower than that. Being colossal did not mean being fast. It meant being efficient, predictable, and above all, safe. Yet even walking slowly, each step demanded enormous energy. Vast muscles had to contract, huge hearts had to pump, and every cell in that towering body needed oxygen. How did their lungs and airways keep up with such a colossal oxygen bill? As we step back hundreds of millions of years and look inside their chests, we find a respiratory system that does not resemble ours at all. Join us as we set the stage for air sacs, unidirectional flow, and a bird-like lung that turned each careful stride into an engine of astonishing efficiency. Inside a sauropod chest, air did not simply drift in and out the way it does in ours. It swept through. It followed a path. With each breath, these giants may have moved air in one direction across their lungs, much like modern birds do today. In mammals like us, breathing is tidal. Air flows in, mixes in the lungs, and then flows back out along the same route, leaving behind a surprising amount of unused oxygen. Sauropods, by contrast, seem to have been built around a unidirectional flow system. Air would have surged down the windpipe, through rigid lungs, and then into a network of air sacs before being pulled through again, keeping fresh oxygen-rich air washing over the gas exchange surfaces almost continuously. For a body the size of a building, this was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Join us as we picture that system in motion. The lungs themselves were likely relatively compact and fixed deep in the chest, while vast air sacs ballooned into the neck, the torso, and even the tail. In birds, these sacs do not exchange gases directly. Instead, they act as bellows, driving air through the lungs and smoothing the flow so that oxygen extraction per breath is far higher than in a typical mammal. Applied to the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth, this design meant that every breath counted more, delivering the oxygen needed to fuel colossal hearts, massive muscles, and long sweeping strides. How do we know these air sacs were really there in animals that vanished tens of millions of years ago? The evidence is written inside their bones. Many sauropod vertebrae are not solid blocks of tissue. They are riddled with chambers, grooves, and delicate internal struts, a pattern called pneumaticity. In life, these spaces were filled by extensions of the air sac system, invading the skeleton from within. When paleontologists cut or scan these ancient bones, they see honeycombed interiors where we might expect solid stone, a clear signature of a bird-like respiratory architecture. This invasion of air did more than move oxygen. It reshaped the entire body. By replacing heavy bone and tissue with air-filled cavities, sauropods reduced their overall density, making their enormous frames lighter than they looked. Air sacs also acted as internal radiators, absorbing heat from working muscles and distributing it through a vast, ventilated volume. In a warm Mesozoic world, this combination of efficient gas exchange and built-in cooling helped set the stage for a world of scale we can barely imagine, where land animals approached or even rivaled the massive modern blue whales. Yet there is a paradox hidden in this airy design. Those same pneumatic spaces that lightened the skeleton also hollowed it out. How do you build a neck as long as a bus, supported by vertebrae laced with empty chambers, and still keep it strong enough to lift, swing, and feed without snapping? To answer that, we must leave the lungs behind and step into the architecture of the sauropod spine itself. To understand how that spine could work, we need to look inside the bones themselves. Not at the hard outer shell, but at the strange hidden architecture within. This is where sauropods turned solid rock into something closer to engineered air. When we slice through a sauropod vertebra, we do not see a simple block. We see a cathedral. Thin bony walls, intersecting struts, and branching chambers create a maze-like interior, a complex lattice of bone and void. In some species, those vertebrae were 60 to 70% air by volume. Imagine a bone as large as a human torso, yet lighter than it appears, its weight stripped away and replaced by carefully organized emptiness. This was not random hollowness. It was design by evolution. The internal structure of these colossal neck and backbones resembles the trusses inside a bridge or the framework of a skyscraper. Forces are routed along slender beams, tension and compression channeled through intersecting struts, so that no part carries more than it must. Engineers use the same principle to span rivers and support towers with the least possible material. Sauropods were doing it in living tissue, tens of millions of years before the first human blueprint. By carving air into their skeletons, these giants solved a fundamental problem of scale. A neck twice as long is not just twice as heavy. In a solid animal, it can be many times heavier. But a neck built from pneumatic vertebrae, riddled with air spaces and reinforced by internal buttresses, can grow longer and longer without a matching explosion in mass. The torso, too, could expand to house vast lungs and fermenting guts, yet remain light enough for pillar-like limbs to support. Join us as we step back hundreds of millions of years and recognize a familiar pattern. Modern birds, the direct descendants of one branch of theropod dinosaurs, use the same strategy. Their wing bones and vertebrae are air-filled, linked to an advanced system of air sacs that move oxygen-rich air in a near one-way flow through the lungs. Sauropods show similar pneumatic cavities and connections, hinting at bird-like lungs inside bodies that outweighed entire herds of mammals. This shared architecture helps set the stage for understanding the deep evolutionary link between non-avian dinosaurs and the flocks that still cross our skies. In this ancient world of scale we can barely imagine, lighter bones and efficient lungs answered two immense challenges: weight and oxygen. Yet one more problem towered above them. How do you drive blood up a neck as tall as a building against the gravity, without the heart failing or the vessels bursting? To follow these giants higher still, we must now leave bone and air behind and confront the brutal physics of circulation. To push blood up a tower of flesh is as hard as building the tower itself. Bone and air solved weight and oxygen, but circulation faced a harsher master: gravity. When we look for living guidance, we do not start with dinosaurs. We start with the tallest necks in our own world. Giraffes are our modern test case. Their hearts beat with pressures far higher than ours, driving blood up 2 to 3 meters of neck to reach a brain that must never be starved of oxygen. They carry thick, muscular vessel walls and a dense network of valves in the veins of the neck and head. When a giraffe lowers its skull to drink, those valves and tight skin, sheaths, act like a pressure suit, preventing blood from rushing forward and flooding delicate tissues. Even in this relatively modest giant, the cardiovascular system is already straining against physical limits. Now extend that challenge from a 2-meter neck to 1/6, 8, or even 10 meters long. Some models suggest that if sauropods routinely held their heads high, the blood pressure at the heart might have needed to be 2 to 3 times that of a giraffe, and far beyond any mammal alive today. Imagine a heart so massive it may have rivaled a small car in volume, its walls thick and powerful, each contraction forcing blood up a vertical column the height of a building. Could such a heart even beat without tearing itself apart? To answer that, scientists have explored several possibilities. One hypothesis keeps the colossal heart, but adds structural reinforcements, exceptionally strong arteries, perhaps supported by surrounding tissues, and a chest cavity shaped to cradle this muscular pump. Another suggests that the heart did not work alone. Along the neck, there may have been auxiliary booster regions, expansions of vessels or muscular cuffs that helped push blood stepwise toward the brain, like stations on a high-pressure pipeline. A third solution is behavioral. Perhaps many sauropods rarely held their heads fully vertical, instead sweeping them in broad arcs closer to heart level, trading extreme browsing height for safer, more stable blood flow. Here we collide with one of the deepest uncertainties in dinosaur science. Hearts, vessels, and valves are soft tissues. They almost never fossilize. We do not dig up preserved aortas beside Argentinosaurus ribs. Instead, we infer. We scale up from giraffes and birds. We run fluid dynamics simulations. We test what pressures bones and tissues could plausibly withstand. The results do not give us a single blueprint, but a range of workable designs that could have kept these giants alive. At this point, we must step back hundreds of millions of years and ask a different question. If sauropods needed near impossible blood pressures, potential booster pumps, and strict postures just to stay conscious, are we brushing against a hard upper limit for life on land? Do gravity and fluid dynamics themselves set the stage for how big the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth can become? Join us as we follow that limit to its breaking point If blood pressure and gravity push land life toward a hard ceiling, the oceans seem to offer a tempting escape hatch. In water, mass does not feel the same. A blue whale may weigh as much as a small airliner, yet it moves with a slow, effortless grace that no land animal could match. Why does the sea make such colossal bodies possible in a way dry ground almost never can? The key is buoyancy. Water supports weight. Every cubic meter of a whale's body displaces almost a cubic meter of seawater, and that displaced water pushes back, quietly carrying much of the animal's mass. Its skeleton and muscles do not have to resist its full weight the way a sauropods did. Instead of fighting gravity every second, the whale is partially suspended, as if the entire ocean were an invisible harness. That support changes everything. Because their bodies are effectively lighter in water, blue whales do not need legs like stone columns or hips as wide as a car to hold themselves up. Their vertebrae and ribs are large, but they are not massively overbuilt the way sauropod limb bones are. A whale's spine is shaped to flex and undulate, to transmit waves of motion down a streamlined body, not to prop up a walking tower of flesh. On land, the story is very different. A sauropod's limb bones are thick, straight, and arranged like pillars, with expanded joints that spread forces into the surrounding skeleton. Each step meant supporting tens of tons on just a few feet at a time, under full terrestrial gravity. Their bones had to resist bending and crushing loads that a whale's skeleton, cushioned by water, rarely experiences. In a very real sense, the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth were engineering solutions to a problem whales barely have. Join us as we look more closely at those contrasts. Blue whales still face daunting challenges. Their immense bodies generate heat they must shed into water that can be icy cold. They must store enough oxygen in blood and muscle to power long, deep dives, then surface to refill those reserves. Yet for them, structural support is not the primary constraint. The ocean already set the stage by lifting most of their bulk away from gravity's pull. This is why some biologists describe marine gigantism as easy mode. If the sea relaxes the rules, then any land animal approaching whale mass is playing on hard mode, with no such forgiveness. And yet, in the Mesozoic era, sauropods stepped back hundreds of millions of years before us and appeared to do exactly that. How did they solve problems that blue whales never even had to face? In the next section, we enter a world of scale we can barely imagine and examine the strange air-filled bones and pillar limbs that let land giants challenge the ocean's monopoly on size. To keep such a body alive, bone and air were not enough. A land giant is not just an engineering project, it is an energy problem. Every heartbeat, every step, depends on a continuous river of food. So how much salad does a titanosaur need? For a 60 to 80-ton sauropod, estimates suggest it may have consumed several hundred kilograms of plant material every single day. Not a few armfuls of leaves, but a moving harvest on 4 legs, stripping branches, ferns, and cycads, the way a modern elephant clears shrubs. Imagine a single animal eating its own body weight in vegetation in a matter of weeks. Now imagine herds of them spread across a floodplain. To do this without burning more energy than they gained, these giants evolved one of their most iconic features: the colossal neck. The neck of a titanosaur was not just dramatic ornament, it was a feeding boom. By keeping the heavy torso and pillar limbs rooted in place, a sauropod could sweep its head in a wide arc, grazing or browsing across a huge 3-dimensional feeding envelope. Instead of marching its massive body from tree to tree, it moved only a lightweight skull and a cable of air-filled vertebrae. Join us as we picture one of the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth, standing almost motionless in a Mesozoic forest, its neck gliding from ground cover to mid-level shrubs to the high canopy. Each slow step reset the boom, opening up a fresh circle of foliage. This strategy reduced the mechanical stress on bones and muscles, and it also saved time. When you must process hundreds of kilograms of low-calorie plants each day, every extra mouthful within easy reach matters. Inside the body, another system took over. Sauropods did very little chewing. Their simple, peg-like or spoon-shaped teeth clipped plants and sent them down to vast abdominal chambers. There, enormous guts likely hosted complex fermentation, with microbial communities breaking down cellulose and other tough plant tissues over many hours or even days. Gas, heat, and volatile chemicals would have filled these internal bioreactors, trading speed for efficiency in a world where food volume, not quality, defined survival. This digestive strategy only works if the environment can keep up. The Mesozoic era, especially the Jurassic and Cretaceous, offered warm climates, high atmospheric carbon dioxide, and long-growing seasons that fueled lush, fast-growing vegetation. Fern prairies, conifer forests, horsetail thickets, and later, flowering plants set the stage for landscapes that could sustain dense populations of massive herbivores. In such an ancient world, entire river valleys may have functioned like conveyor belts of biomass, regrowing quickly after each wave of feeding. But there is a catch. Bodies that large take a long time to build. Slow growth, long lifespans, and enormous food demands make every adult a major investment of time and resources. When a giant finally died, how did the ecosystem replace it? How do you keep a lineage of titans going when each individual is so costly to produce? So how do you replace a fallen giant that took decades to build? You start with something that looks almost impossibly small. From eggs hidden in warm sand to a creature heavier than a 737, this is a growth story that seems to break every rule of biology. But how do we know any of this when all we have are scattered bones locked in ancient rock? When we step back hundreds of millions of years into the Mesozoic era, we do not find colossal wombs or single massive offspring. We find eggs. Sauropod eggs. They are surprisingly modest, often no bigger than a volleyball or a small melon, even for the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. Instead of investing in one or two giant young, many species laid large clutches, sometimes dozens of eggs, buried in shallow pits or mounded nests. The sun, warm soils, or even geothermal heat did most of the incubation work. The parents did not sit on their nests the way birds do today. Their own massive weight would have crushed their future. That strategy came with a consequence. The hatchlings that emerged were tiny compared to the adults around them. A baby titan that might one day rival a blue whale in mass began life closer in size to a house cat or a small dog. To bridge that staggering gap within a reasonable lifespan, these animals had to grow fast, not leisurely, reptile-style growth, but a sustained biological sprint. How can we tell? The answer lies inside the bones themselves. When paleontologists slice through sauropod bones and polish them into thin sections, a hidden record appears. Growth rings, like those in trees, sometimes mark seasonal slowdowns. Between them, dense networks of blood vessel canals show that these bones were highly vascularized, flooded with nutrients. The pattern is far closer to what we see in rapidly growing birds and mammals than in modern reptiles. It tells us that young sauropods were building tissue at extraordinary rates year after year. Join us as we follow that growth curve. Models based on bone histology suggest that some sauropods may have reached several tons within a decade, and near-adult sizes in just a few more. Rapid growth was not just about becoming massive, it was a survival strategy. In a world filled with predators, small juveniles were vulnerable. Many likely died before reaching maturity. By growing quickly and reaching reproductive age early, sauropods could begin producing their own clutches long before they reached their ultimate size, offsetting high juvenile mortality and the long road to full gigantism. This life history strategy, many small eggs, fast-growing young, early reproduction, and long-lived adults, set the stage for a world of scale we can barely imagine. Yet bones and growth rings are only part of the story. To understand how those rapidly growing bodies actually functioned, how hearts, lungs, and limbs coped with such mass, we need to look even closer at their internal design. To look inside that internal design, we have to treat bones not just as relics, but as records. Not just scattered remains, but diaries written in tissue and mineral. When we slice into a fossil limb from one of the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth, we are opening a history book of growth, stress, and survival. Paleontologists call this bone histology. A fragment of Argentinosaurus thigh, for example, can be cut into a wafer-thin section, polished until it is almost transparent, and placed under a microscope. Suddenly, that massive column of stone reveals delicate growth rings, looping blood vessel channels, and patches where the bone has been broken down and rebuilt. It is as if an ancient forest of cells has been frozen in time. Those rings work much like the rings in a tree trunk. Wide, closely spaced bands can signal rapid growth during a favorable period, while narrower rings suggest slower growth or environmental stress. By counting and measuring them, researchers can estimate how old a dinosaur was when it died, how quickly it raced through its juvenile years, and whether it kept growing slowly, even as an adult. In the largest sauropods, the density of blood vessel canals and the intensity of remodeling hint at a metabolism far more active than that of modern reptiles. Join us as we follow these clues deeper. When scientists compare the microscopic texture of sauropod bones with those of birds and mammals, they find similar patterns associated with fast growth and high metabolic rates. That means these giants may have grown from hatchling to multi-ton adolescent in just a few decades. How could a land animal add that much mass that quickly, without collapsing under its own weight? To answer that, we have to see not only the surface, but the interior. Modern CT scanning allows researchers to peer through fossil bones without damaging them. A vertebra from Patagodon can be rotated in 3 dimensions, revealing honeycomb-like internal struts and vast air-filled spaces. These scans feed into 3D models, which in turn become digital skeletons that can be posed, loaded with virtual muscles, and tested in biomechanical simulations. Engineers model how leg bones bend under each step. Medical imaging specialists refine lung and air sac reconstructions. Comparative anatomists align dinosaur joints with those of birds and crocodiles to limit what is physically possible. Together, this interdisciplinary effort helps set the stage for understanding how hearts pumped, how necks flexed, and how column-like limbs supported such colossal bodies in a world of scale we can barely imagine. And yet, even with microscopes, CT scanners, and powerful computers, we are often working from heartbreakingly little. For some of the largest dinosaurs, all of this intricate analysis rests on a handful of vertebrae, a partial limb, or a single hip bone. What happens when those few fragments hint at a creature so massive that our best models say it should not have been able to stand, let alone walk? So when a few scattered bones whisper of a land animal rivaling a blue whale, we have to ask, how much is real, and how much is our imagination filling the void? We are not looking at complete skeletons laid out in museum perfection. We are looking at fragments weathering out of remote badlands in an ancient world that rarely preserved its biggest citizens whole. Before humans, before cities, before history itself, layers of mud and sand buried the remains of giants, not whole herds, not even whole bodies. Often just a series of vertebrae, a massive thigh bone, or a curved rib as long as a person. Many of the largest titanosaurs, including contenders like Argentinosaurus and Patagodon, are known from just such fragments, found eroding from cliffs in Patagonia or scattered across windswept plateaus. The biggest creatures to ever walk the earth are, paradoxically, among the least completely known. So how do we move from a handful of bones to a full animal? Join us as we follow the comparative method that underpins these colossal reconstructions. Paleontologists begin by identifying which part of the skeleton each bone represents, then compare it to better-known relatives such as Dreadnoughtus or more complete, smaller titanosaurs. If a femur is 20% longer but similar in shape, they scale up the rest of the body using established relationships between limb length, body volume, and mass. This is not guesswork in the casual sense. It is an informed extrapolation, rooted in biomechanics and in patterns repeated again and again across the sauropod family. Yet, it carries risk. What if the known bones come from an unusually large individual, the dinosaur equivalent of a record-breaking weightlifter? What if we have, by chance, only the most robust vertebrae from the base of the neck, rather than the more slender bones further along the spine? A single overbuilt element can set the stage for an overbuilt reconstruction. That is why debates over mass estimates for these giants are so intense. Some volumetric models for Argentinosaurus have suggested masses that brush against or even exceed the heaviest blue whales, while others, using more conservative body shapes, pull those numbers down by tens of tons. In the scientific literature, you will find careful arguments for trimming away the most extreme values, not to diminish the wonder, but to avoid sensationalism that outruns the evidence. Here is where our mental image can shift in an instant. Imagine one reconstruction of Argentinosaurus, a body deep and barrel-shaped, limbs flared, neck thick, yielding a creature perhaps 80 or 90 tons. Now imagine a second version, built from the same bones but with a slimmer torso, slightly narrower hips, a less bulky tail. The mass drops to 60 or 70 tons, still colossal, but no longer an impossible leviathan. Two silhouettes, one skeleton. Which animal do we carry in our minds when we picture this era of extremes? In that gap between bone and body, between cautious model and maximal monster, lies a world of scale we can barely imagine, and to test which vision comes closest to reality, we must turn from scattered fossils to the unforgiving rules of physics. Physics sets the rules, but fossils test how far life was willing to bend them. When we ask whether any dinosaur truly beat a blue whale, we step into a fog of estimates, error bars, and rare colossal individuals. To even attempt an answer, we have to start with numbers. Argentinosaurus, known from a scattered but massive set of limbs and hip bones, is often modeled in the 70 to 80 metric ton range, with a few reconstructions nudging toward 90. Patagoteton, based on a richer skeleton, tends to cluster around 60 to 70 tons. Dreadnoughtus, once heralded as the ultimate giant, has settled after revisions into a similar band, roughly 50 to 60 tons. These are the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth that we can currently measure with any confidence. Now we look across the water. Blue whales are frequently quoted at 150 to 200 tons, but those figures describe very rare theoretical maxima. Most weighed and well-documented blue whales fall between about 70 and 120 tons, with only a handful of historical records pushing beyond that. In other words, the typical giant whale is not that far from the typical giant titanosaur. Their mass ranges overlap. This is where uncertainty matters. Sauropod masses are not measured with a scale. They are inferred from bone circumference, limb proportions, and 3D volumetric models that must guess at muscle bulk, fat, and even lung size. Change the assumed density of those air-filled vertebrae, and Argentinosaurus might shrink toward 60 tons or swell toward 90. Adjust the body outline of Patagoteton by a few tens of centimeters, and you move several tons up or down. Every estimate carries wide error bars. Whales, too, are tricky. The heaviest blue whales ever reported, those legendary 170 to 190 ton behemoths, were exceptional individuals, recorded during the peak of 20th century whaling. Most living whales today are smaller, partly because we removed many of the largest animals from the gene pool. How many truly maximal whales have we never measured? How many truly maximal sauropods have we never fossilized? Join us as we imagine the extremes. At the upper edge of their plausible ranges, the biggest titanosaurs and the heaviest blue whales may have been broadly comparable, separated by perhaps a few tens of tons either way. Well within the combined uncertainties of bone, flesh, and missing data, current evidence does not conclusively prove that any dinosaur outweighed the heaviest recorded blue whale. Yet it strongly suggests that at their peaks, land and sea produced giants in the same astonishing league. And that, in some ways, is the deeper mystery. Because even if no dinosaur quite surpassed the very fattest whale, the fact that any land animal approached that mass at all defies our intuition. To understand how evolution on solid ground could set the stage for such a world of scale we can barely imagine, we have to look beyond size charts and into the brutal constraints of bones, blood, and breath. Bones, blood, and breath were only part of the story. Out in the Cretaceous sunlight, those impossible bodies moved through a landscape filled with teeth. When we step back hundreds of millions of years into the final act of the Mesozoic era, we do not find peaceful herds grazing in isolation. We find Argentinosaurus and its kin living alongside some of the biggest predators to ever walk the earth. In what is now Patagonia, colossal theropods like Giganotosaurus and Mapusaurus stalked the same floodplains, their skulls longer than a person is tall, their jaws lined with blades built to slice flesh from bone. These were not solitary hunters in a quiet world. Evidence from bone beds suggests that Mapusaurus may have lived, and perhaps hunted, in groups, circling herds of titanosaurs the way wolves circle bison today. Even if a healthy adult sauropod was difficult to bring down, a sick individual, a stranded juvenile, or the carcass of a fallen giant would have been a massive prize. A single kill could feed a whole assemblage of predators and scavengers. In such an ancient arms race, size itself becomes a weapon. A young sauropod was small, vulnerable, and numerous, but every year it survived brought a payoff. More height, more mass, more safety. Once a titanosaur crossed a certain threshold, its sheer bulk made it an unattractive target. Why risk shattered teeth and broken ribs against a 30 or 40-ton wall of bone and muscle when smaller, easier prey moved all around? Natural selection would favor any lineage in which more juveniles lived long enough to reach that relatively invulnerable stage. That, in turn, pushes behavior to evolve. Join us as we imagine a nesting ground, not a few scattered eggs, but vast colonies stretching across a coastal plain, each nest a shallow bowl of eggs buried in vegetation and sediment. Fossil nesting sites from South America and India suggest that some titanosaurs returned to the same areas again and again, laying in dense clusters. Did this overwhelm predators with sheer numbers, ensuring that at least some hatchlings slipped through the gauntlet? Did loose herds of subadults and adults form shifting rings of protection around the smallest members of the group? For some titanosaurs, bones tell an even more dramatic story. Embedded in their skin were osteoderms, armor-like plates and nodules of bone, sometimes the size of a dinner plate, sometimes forming low ridges along the back. These were not full-body shells like an ankylosaur, but they were enough to turn a bite, to make the neck or flanks harder to penetrate. The presence of such defenses in animals already so massive speaks volumes about the intensity of their world. Predators grew larger and more coordinated. Herbivores responded with greater size, thicker hides, and literal armor. Yet all of this played out on a planet that refused to stand still. While giants and hunters escalated their struggle, volcanoes reshaped continents, climates swung, seas advanced and retreated. And at the very end, a rock from space drew a brutal line under their long experiment with size. All of that slow-motion arms race, all of those colossal bodies tuned to their ancient world depend on one quiet assumption, that tomorrow will look like today. For a herd of titanosaurs on a late Cretaceous floodplain, it does. Warm air shimmers above ferns and flowering shrubs. Necks as long as buses sweep in slow arcs, stripping leaves from trees that have fed their kind for tens of millions of years. Footsteps the size of bathtubs press deep into damp soil, but the rhythm is calm, almost timeless. Then, in the middle of an ordinary day, the sky writes a new rule. At first, it is only a point of light, brighter than any star but easy to ignore beneath the sun. Moments pass. The point lengthens into a white-hot streak. Shadows twist. Animals lift their heads, blinking as the streak blooms, thickens and races across the heavens, expanding faster than instinct can interpret. We step back hundreds of millions of years in our imagination, but what happens next unfolds in seconds. The world turns to fire. A flash, brighter than anything these giants have ever seen, washes the landscape in blinding white. Forest edges ignite where they stand. A shockwave slams outward from the impact site with the force of a global hammer, flattening coastal forests, hurling trees and bodies alike to the ground. Air itself becomes a weapon, compressed and then unleashed in walls of wind that scour floodplains clean. Where the rock meets earth, crust and ocean are vaporized. Molten debris arcs high above the atmosphere and then falls back as incandescent rain, seeding wildfires on continents and ocean away. For animals that once shaped their world with every step, the balance flips. Now the world shapes them brutally. Within hours, vast regions burn. Within days, dust, soot, and sulfur veil the sky. Sunlight fades to a dim twilight. Photosynthesis stalls. Temperatures plunge. For weeks to months, a planet that had nurtured the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth is wrapped in cold, choking darkness. From the dinosaur's perspective, this is not a slow decline. A world that supported giants for more than 100 million years ends in what, on geological scales, is the span of a breath. There is no time to shift ranges, to evolve new teeth, to wait out a bad season. The very foundations of their food webs are stripped away almost overnight. What happens to a creature that has pushed body size to the limit when the environment it depends on collapses this fast? Massive herbivores need constant supplies of plant matter. Huge predators rely on stable herds of prey. When plants die, the pyramid beneath the giants crumbles first. Join us as we step out of the chaos and into a more measured view of this extinction. In the next section, we will set the stage for how this single impact reshaped evolution, and why, in the harsh new world that followed, being enormous was no longer the winning strategy it had once been. In the quiet after the firestorm, the age of giants was over. Not slowly, not gracefully. In geological terms, it ended in an instant. The leading explanation points us to a single catastrophic event. Around 66 million years ago, an asteroid more than 10 kilometers across slammed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, carving the Chicxulub crater and releasing energy equal to billions of nuclear bombs. At almost the same time, massive volcanic eruptions in the Deccan Traps of India poured out oceans of lava and greenhouse gases. Together, impact and volcanism set the stage for one of the most sudden and severe mass extinctions in Earth's history. In the immediate aftermath, dust, pulverized rock, and sulfur-rich aerosols were blasted high into the atmosphere. Sunlight dimmed. For months, perhaps years, the bright, warm Cretaceous skies gave way to a murky twilight. Photosynthesis faltered. Forests withered. Plankton in the seas declined. When plants at the base of the food web collapsed, everything above them began to unravel. This was a world of scale we can barely imagine, and that scale became a deadly liability. Titanosaurs, some rivaling or even surpassing the blue whale in mass, depended on vast quantities of vegetation every single day. A single adult may have needed hundreds of kilograms of plant matter just to maintain its bulk. Their bodies were masterpieces of efficiency, but no amount of anatomical innovation could compensate when the buffet itself disappeared. large animals share two dangerous traits in a crisis. They have enormous absolute food requirements, and they reproduce slowly. A titanosaur took many years to grow from a hatchling to one of the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. It could not simply switch to a new food source overnight, and it could not rapidly rebuild its population after losses. When ecosystems crash on a timescale of decades or centuries, giants run out of both calories and time. In contrast, many smaller animals were better suited to ride out the chaos. Tiny mammals could hide in burrows, feed on seeds, insects, or carrion, and breed quickly when conditions improved. Some reptiles and amphibians could estivate or hibernate through harsh seasons. Most importantly, one branch of small feathered theropods, early birds, could exploit scattered resources, move long distances, and shelter in microhabitats that remained relatively stable. They needed less, and they could adapt faster. Who would you bet on in a darkened, starving world? A 70-ton herbivore or a sparrow-sized omnivore? Join us as we follow that surviving branch. The non-avian dinosaurs vanished, but their legacy did not. Their descendants still flash across our skies and sing from city trees. In the next section, we will step back hundreds of millions of years and trace how these fragile-looking birds carry within them the blueprint of the ancient giants they outlived. Those city sparrows and garden pigeons are not just distant relatives of dinosaurs. In a strict evolutionary sense, they are dinosaurs. When we look at a bird, we are not just seeing a survivor of the Mesozoic era. We are seeing one branch of theropod dinosaurs that never ended. Paleontologists can trace that branch back through time, bone by bone. The sickle-clawed raptors of the Cretaceous, feathered hunters like Velociraptor and Deinonychus, sit inside the same family tree as modern eagles and chickens. Following that tree, there is no clean break, no moment when dinosaurs vanish and birds appear. There is only evolution, gradually reshaping one lineage until wings replace grasping hands and tail fans replace long bony whips. This continuity is written into their skeletons and organs. Both birds and many non-avian theropods had hollow, air-filled bones, a design that seems delicate but can support powerful muscles and rapid movement. Their chests housed complex air sacs that pushed air through the lungs in a single direction, unlike the in and out flow we see in mammals. The result is a highly efficient, bird-like lung system that can pull oxygen from the air, even during intense exertion. When we study how a hawk breathes in thin mountain air, or how a goose fuels nonstop migration, we are peering into the same respiratory blueprint that once helped the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. Those air sacs did not belong only to small, agile hunters. Evidence from sauropod vertebrae suggests that their colossal necks and backs were also riddled with pneumatic cavities. Air, not solid bone, filled much of their interior, lightening their frames and linking their lungs to a vast system of sacs. Reproduction tells a similar story. Birds lay hard-shelled eggs, build nests, and often brood their young with body heat. Fossilized theropod dinosaurs have been found curled over clutches of eggs in brooding postures almost identical to those of modern birds. Growth rings inside fossil bones show rapid juvenile growth, more like a chick racing to adulthood than a slow-maturing reptile. By watching how fast a hummingbird's heart beats, how quickly a chick reaches full size, or how an ostrich manages its massive body on relatively light bones, we begin to infer dinosaur metabolism. Were many dinosaurs warm-blooded in the way birds are? How did those bird-style lungs scale up to feed a sauropod's vast body? And here, the contrast becomes astonishing. The same lineage that produced tiny hummingbirds, weighing less than a coin, also produced multi-ton predators and plant-eating titans whose hearts may have rivaled small cars. From titans to sparrows, one anatomical toolkit spans a world of scale we can barely imagine. Join us as we follow that toolkit into its most extreme test, because understanding this unbroken line does more than link birds to their ancient cousins. It forces us to ask a deeper question. If the bird blueprint could stretch to blue whale rivaling masses on land, what does that say about the ultimate limits and possibilities of life on Earth? In that sense, a titanosaur is not just a big animal. It is a data point pressed right up against the boundary of life's design space on land. When we look at these colossal skeletons, we are not only seeing the biggest creatures to ever walk the Earth, we are glimpsing how far flesh, bone, and blood can be pushed before the rules of physics say no. To find that boundary, we return to the constraints that shaped every step these giants took. Bone strength scales differently from body mass. As an animal grows, its weight rises faster than the cross-section of its limb bones. At some point, the stress on those pillars should exceed what living tissue can bear. Sauropods answered with massively thickened limb shafts, crouched, columnar postures, and air-filled vertebrae that stripped weight from the spine. Their entire frame was tuned so that every kilogram of bone carried as many kilograms of body as possible, without snapping. Inside that frame, the challenges multiplied. A neck longer than a bus meant a vertical distance that blood had to climb against gravity. Modeling studies suggest that the hearts of the largest sauropods may have generated arterial pressures far beyond those of any living mammal, with huge muscular walls and perhaps accessory pumps in the neck. Yet push the pressure too high and vessels rupture, too low and the brain starves. In computer simulations, the safe window is narrow. These animals seem to have lived in that window, right on the edge of what circulation can sustain. Their lungs and air sacs also pressed against limits. Bird-style, one-way airflow made each breath more efficient, but at extreme sizes, moving enough air through a body tens of meters long becomes a full-time job. Heat was another invisible boundary. A 70-ton fermenting furnace of plant matter generates enormous internal warmth. Broad torso surfaces, long necks and tails acting as radiators, and perhaps behavior. Seeking shade, favoring nights or breezier uplands, may all have been required just to avoid cooking from the inside out. And all of this machinery only worked because the Mesozoic world fed it. Vast conifer forests, fern plains, and cycads set the stage for near-continuous browsing. Estimates of daily intake for the largest titanosaurs reach hundreds of kilograms of foliage. Remove that productivity, or shorten growing seasons, and the margin of safety vanishes. In many biomechanical and ecological models, sauropods appear not as comfortable giants, but as specialists operating close to multiple ceilings at once. Could anything on land have gone much bigger? On a world with lower gravity, thicker air to support the neck, or different atmospheric gases? Perhaps yes. A slightly lighter pull downward, or even more efficient oxygen delivery, might allow bones, hearts, and lungs to stretch further. But on our ancient Earth, under our gravity and climates, these dinosaurs likely explored the upper neighborhood of what is possible. We cannot name a single precise maximum mass. We can say that when we stand beneath a reconstructed Argentinosaurus, we are standing near that limit, and in the next section, we will ask why nothing on land has ever reached it again. We stand near the limit of what seems possible, but we also stand in a fog. Every colossal bone we uncover reminds us that, with these giants, certainty is rare and revision is constant. In dinosaur science, today's confident number is often tomorrow's footnote. Again and again, new fossils force us to redraw these bodies. A single femur from Patagonia, a neck vertebra from China, a tailbone from Africa, each can stretch or shrink our estimates of mass and length. Patagoteton grew heavier when more of its skeleton was found. Dreadnoughtus slimmed down when researchers remodeled its volume. What looked like the biggest creatures to ever walk the Earth one decade can be overtaken or reclassified the next. At the heart of this uncertainty lies a simple problem. We almost never have the whole animal. So scientists argue, carefully and passionately, about how to fill in the missing pieces. Some start with limb bones, using equations that link bone thickness to body weight in living animals. Others carve digital silhouettes in 3 dimensions, wrapping skin around virtual skeletons and inflating or deflating the body until it matches plausible muscle masses. Still others debate the outline itself. Was the torso barrel-shaped or more slender? Did the tail carry extra muscle for balance, or was it mostly a lightweight counterweight? Soft tissues deepen the mystery. Air-filled sacs in the neck and torso could make a 70-ton skeleton house a surprisingly light, pneumatic body, while thick layers of muscle and fat could push the same frame toward blue whale territory. We do not see these structures directly. We infer them from the cavities in vertebrae, from the lungs of birds, from the way living animals support weight. Join us as we watch scientists argue over how much flesh to drape on these ancient frames, because that argument can swing a titanosaur by tens of tons. This is how science works at this scale. We propose models. We test them against every new bone, every trackway, every biomechanical simulation. When a model fails, when a leg would buckle, or a heart could not pump high enough, we do not cling to it. We adjust the numbers, reshape the body, or, if needed, abandon the idea that a particular species really outweighed a blue whale. In this era of giant discoveries, flexibility is a strength, not a weakness. Yet outside the field, the story often sounds much simpler. Headlines demand the biggest ever. Museum labels prefer a single number, not a range with error bars. We, as viewers, crave records and champions, but the Earth's fossil record is incomplete, and the language of researchers is cautious for a reason. When you read that Argentinosaurus weighed perhaps 60 to 90 tons, you are seeing that caution in action. So let us interrupt our own story. Imagine that tomorrow a nearly complete titanosaur skeleton emerges from the rock: skull, neck, torso, limbs, tail, all in place. No longer a jigsaw of scattered bones, but one colossal animal, preserved from head to tail. Overnight, its measurements could settle the blue whale question, fixing a new benchmark for land-bound mass. In the next section, we will explore what such a discovery would mean for our understanding of limits, not only for dinosaurs, but for life on Earth itself. Somewhere under our feet, in rock older than human civilization by a factor of 10,000, the bones of another giant may be waiting. Not just a scattered rib here, a lonely vertebra there, but the silent outline of a body that once shook the ground with every step. When we look at Argentinosaurus, or Patagotitan today, we are really looking at absences, at spaces in the skeleton where rock has not yet given up its secrets. Vast stretches of Patagonia remain unexplored, cloaked in scrub and wind, their fossil beds only hinted at by a single bone weathering out of a hillside. In other parts of the ancient world, deep tropical forests hide the right rocks entirely, their surfaces veiled by soil, roots, and dense vegetation. Elsewhere, promising formations lie within politically unstable or inaccessible regions, where the field camps, trucks, and months of careful excavation required to reach them are still out of reach. Yet our tools for finding these giants are changing. From orbit, satellites map subtle differences in rock color and chemistry, tracing the outcrops of the right Mesozoic formations beneath dust and sparse plants. Drones skim low over badlands, capturing high-resolution images that reveal bone fragments, trackways, and the eroded cross-sections of ancient river channels. On the ground, geophysicists deploy ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing instruments, probing a few meters below the surface for dense shapes that might be buried limb bones or a collapsed vertebral column. Join us as we follow these signals into a world of scale we can barely imagine. What might still be out there? one possibility is not a new name, but a new level of completeness. A nearly intact Argentinosaurus with skull, neck, torso, limbs, tail all articulated would let us refine mass estimates, reconstruct muscle volumes, and test how close these animals came to the mechanical limits of bone and tendon. A more complete Supersaurus or another diplodocid giant could show whether extreme length and extreme mass ever truly combined in a single individual, or whether nature kept those records separate. The other possibility is more dramatic. Somewhere in Cretaceous rocks, perhaps beneath the forests of South America or the deserts of Africa, there could be a sauropod we have never seen before, with limb bones thicker than any yet measured, or vertebrae even more massive than those of Patagotitan. Could such a discovery finally reveal a land animal that clearly outweighed the heaviest reliably measured blue whales? Or would it simply tighten the cluster of giants already pressing against that upper boundary? Even if we never uncover a dinosaur definitively heavier than a blue whale, each new skeleton sharpens our picture of life's extremes. Every additional neck bone, every better preserved hip joint lets us test how blood pressure, lung capacity, and bone strength scaled in the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. These finds do more than feed record books. They set the stage for the next question. What are the true limits for flesh and bone on our planet? And why did the Mesozoic era come so close to reaching them? Those limits are not just scientific curiosities. They reach straight into our emotions. When we picture a sauropod's shadow sliding over a forest, or imagine its head disappearing into the canopy, we are not only thinking about mass and meters. We are feeling something older and deeper: awe, a trace of fear, and a strange comfort that our world once held such colossal lives. Before humans, before cities, before history itself, the Earth belonged to giants. Not just big animals, but true titans, the biggest creatures to ever walk the Earth. Their necks rose higher than buildings. Their backs formed moving ridgelines across ancient floodplains. Their footfalls would have sent shivers through the ground beneath any small animal nearby. Why do these images stay with us long after we close the book or leave the museum hall? Part of the answer is scale. We live in a human-sized world of doorways, streets, and trees that we can see the top of. When we step back hundreds of millions of years in our imagination and stand beside Argentinosaurus or Patagotitan, our familiar sense of proportion collapses. A single thigh bone is taller than you are. A heart may have been the size of a small car. In that instant, our own bodies and even our buildings feel fragile and temporary. Learning about these giants also compresses time itself. Written history spans only a few thousand years. Agriculture, cities, and states occupy a thin layer of sediment. Yet sauropods ruled for more than 100 million years, surviving climate swings, shifting continents, and local disasters that would erase entire civilizations. When we place our entire story against that backdrop, it becomes a brief spark in a vast, dark theater of deep time. There is a humbling realization here. Earth has already hosted forms of life far beyond anything alive today, and, given enough time, it will likely do so again in very different shapes. Our era of whales, elephants, and humans is just one configuration of ecosystems, one chapter in a much longer narrative of evolution and extinction. Join us as we look at a world of scale we can barely imagine, and we are reminded that nature's experiments did not begin with us and will not end with us. That emotional shock can sharpen our appreciation for the present. Knowing that whole dynasties of giants vanished makes today's ecosystems feel both precious and precarious. Forests that once hid sauropod herds now shelter shrinking populations of much smaller animals. Coral reefs, grasslands, and polar seas all carry the weight of past losses and future uncertainties. If worlds dominated by such massive herbivores can disappear, what does that say about the stability of our own human-shaped world? In the shadow of these vanished giants, a final question emerges and refuses to let go. As the current dominant species, inheriting a planet that once allowed such extremes of life, what exactly do we owe to the fragile living world around us now? And what happens if we fail to answer? When we pull back from the drama of impact craters and vanished forests, something even more astonishing comes into focus. For more than 100 million years, Earth quietly hosted an experiment in size. Land animals pushing toward the mass of whales, walking on soil instead of swimming through water. To understand how that was possible, we have to remember how sauropods were built. They stood on columnar limbs, more like architectural pillars than typical legs, stacking bone directly under bone to bear colossal weight. Their vertebrae were honeycombed with air spaces, pneumatic bones that could be 60 to 70% air by volume, turning what should have been crushingly heavy skeletons into strong, lightweight frameworks. Over this framework, evolution layered bird-like lungs with one-way airflow, vast air sacs stretching into the neck and torso, and hearts powerful enough to drive blood up necks longer than buses. Taken together, these were not just big animals. They were integrated structural and physiological systems tuned to let the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth approach blue whale masses without collapsing. But their story is more than anatomy. It is a lesson in what evolution can do when it is given time, stability, and ecological opportunity. Step back hundreds of millions of years, and we see small, modest dinosaurs gradually exploring new feeding heights, new body plans, new ways of breathing. Generation after generation, natural selection nudged necks a little longer, limbs a little sturdier, lungs a little more efficient. Given enough time, even what looks impossible on paper can become routine in the fossil record. At the same time, these giants remind us how contingent that success really was. The Mesozoic era offered warm, relatively stable climates, high atmospheric carbon dioxide, and plant communities that could fuel immense herbivores. Continents were arranged to create broad lowlands and vast floodplains, habitats where giant bodies could move and feed. If the climate had been cooler, the vegetation poorer, the land broken into harsher, more mountainous terrain, would titanosaurs like Argentinosaurus or Patagotitan ever have arisen? Or would a world of scale we can barely imagine have remained forever unrealized? Their extinction closes the loop. When environments shift slowly, giants can adapt. When they lurch abruptly, large, slow-reproducing animals are often the first to vanish. In our own era, elephants, great whales, and other modern giants face pressures that echo the ancient crises that ended the age of sauropods. Rapid climate change, habitat loss, disrupted food webs. The same rules that once set the stage for dinosaur gigantism now place living species at risk. Join us as we carry this forward. These fossils do not just tell us where the limits of life once were. They warn us how fragile those limits can be when the world changes too fast. What we choose to do with that knowledge, in our brief moment of dominance, is the question that still hangs over the planet they left behind. So where does that leave the biggest dinosaurs in the only contest most of us instinctively care about? Were any of them truly larger than a blue whale? To answer that, we have to be precise. When we talk about the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth, we are really asking whether a land animal could ever match the mass of the ocean's reigning giant. Based on the best evidence we have, the answer is that several colossal sauropods almost certainly did. Argentinosaurus, Patagotitan, and a few other titanosaurs cluster in the same astonishing range as most adult blue whales, somewhere around 50 to perhaps 70 metric tons, depending on which reconstruction you use. Some estimates go higher. A particularly massive Argentinosaurus or Patagotitan model can reach 80 or even 90 tons on paper, overlapping the lower end of the heaviest blue whales ever recorded. Yet we must be careful. Those dinosaur numbers come from incomplete skeletons, scaled from limb bones and vertebrae, and from 3D volume models that must assume how much flesh wrapped those ancient frames. Change the body outline slightly, and the mass shifts by many tons. Whales are not simple either. The largest blue whale measurements come from a handful of 20th century whaling records, with lengths and masses that include variable amounts of blood, water, and fat. Many modern biologists suspect that some of the highest figures, approaching 150 tons, are overestimates, and that most living blue whales today are substantially lighter. So can we say with certainty that any dinosaur outweigh the single heaviest blue whale ever measured? No. The data are simply not good enough on either side to make that claim honestly. But this is where the real marvel begins. The core wonder is not which lineage wins by a few tons. The miracle is that land animals, constrained by gravity, bone strength, and the need to support their own bodies, pushed into the same mass range as ocean giants that float their weight in water. This was a world of scale we can barely imagine, where a sauropod's heart may have rivaled a small car and its neck stretched longer than a city bus, yet it still walked, fed, and grew. How was that even possible? The Mesozoic era itself set the stage. Warm, relatively stable climates, high atmospheric CO2, and lush plant growth provided the energy budget. Sauropod anatomy did the rest. Air-filled vertebrae that could be up to 2/3 empty space, bird-like lungs that moved air efficiently, small heads on long necks that let them harvest vast feeding envelopes without marching constantly across the landscape. And evolution had time, over 100 million years of experimentation, to refine these giants. Join us as we sit with that realization. If life on one ancient Earth could solve problems that seem impossible on paper, what might evolution achieve in the deep future, under new climates and new constraints? And if we step back hundreds of millions of years in our imagination, out beyond our own planet, what other kinds of giants might be waiting on distant worlds, testing the limits of biology in ways we have not yet even conceived? When we step back hundreds of millions of years in our imagination, it can feel abstract, almost unreal. So bring it closer. Picture yourself not staring at a skeleton in a museum, but standing outside, on sun-warmed rock, inside the footprint of a giant. The impression in the stone is a single sauropod track, pressed into soft mud nearly 90 million years ago. Your entire body fits inside it. You could lie down, stretch out your arms, and still not touch the edges. The heel forms a shallow basin. The toes rise like low ridges, and for a moment, you're not just looking at evidence of the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth. You are standing where one of them actually placed its foot. Before humans, before cities, before history itself, this ancient world belonged to such giants, not just big animals, but true titans, with legs like moving pillars and necks that swept through the air above fern forests and conifer groves. That single step, now frozen in stone, was part of a journey across a landscape that has completely vanished, under skies we would barely recognize, in an era when mammals were small, and our own lineage was still an unremarkable experiment. Against that backdrop, our presence is astonishingly thin. Our species has existed for only a few 100,000 years, a brief flicker at the end of a 4.5 billion year story. The Mesozoic era alone, from the first small dinosaurs to the final extinction, lasted more than 180 million years. How do we measure our crowded cities, our brief lifetimes, against that colossal stretch of time and evolution? Yet this thin sliver of human time carries a new kind of power. We have inherited a planet shaped by countless experiments like the titanosaurs. Successes and failures written into mountains, riverbeds, and fossil beds. The same Earth that once supported Argentinosaurus and its relatives now supports us. What we burn, build, protect, or destroy will set the stage for whatever comes next. Are we treating that inheritance as a temporary backdrop or as a responsibility? Learning about these giants is not just collecting trivia about lengths and masses. It is training ourselves to think in deep time, to feel the weight of 90 million years under our feet, to recognize that we live inside a world of scale we can barely imagine. That kind of perspective breeds humility, but also a sharper sense of agency. When you stand in that footprint in your mind, you are touching a boundary between what was and what will be. Join us as we follow that boundary a little further and ask, what exactly do these vanished titans expect of us, the brief, noisy species that came after them? They expect, at the very least, that we remember them, that we try to understand how such impossible lives could have unfolded on this planet. Under the same sky we stand beneath now. Over the last hour, we have stepped back hundreds of millions of years and followed that story from its fragile beginning. We watched the first small Triassic dinosaurs, fox-sized and uncertain, testing new ways of moving in a recovering world. We crossed into the Jurassic, the golden age of the sauropods, when long-necked herbivores rose on pillar-like limbs and began to dominate entire landscapes. Then we entered the Cretaceous, where titanosaurs such as Argentinosaurus and Patagotitan pushed land animal size to its limits, brushing against the mass of the blue whale itself. Again and again we met creatures that, by simple rules of thumb, should not have worked. Bones should have snapped. Hearts should have failed. Lungs should have starved for oxygen. Yet evolution, physics, and environment did not stand apart. Together they set the stage for giants. Pneumatic, air-filled vertebrae lightened colossal spines. Bird-like lungs swept air in a single direction. Long necks traded heavy chewing heads for distant, efficient feeding. Wrapped in warm climates, high plant productivity, and ancient atmospheres rich in CO2, the biggest creatures to ever walk the earth did more than survive. They thrived. So, after everything we have seen, what do you think? In your mind, which giant stands tallest? Is it Argentinosaurus, with a body mass that may have overlapped the heaviest living blue whales? Is it Supersaurus, stretching in length beyond city buses, lined nose to tail? Or is your favorite something smaller, a Camarasaurus or Saltosaurus, that still speaks most clearly to you about this world of scale we can barely imagine? Tell us in the comments which giant dinosaur you would choose and why. Do you think any of them truly beat the blue whale in sheer mass? Or does the ocean's modern titan still hold the crown in your eyes? Your answers are part of this story now, because each comparison you make, each question you raise, keeps these animals alive in our collective imagination. If journeys like this move you, if you want more deep dive, long-form explorations into Earth's strangest and most extreme life forms, we invite you to stay with us. Like this video so others can find it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Share it with someone who has stood beneath a museum skeleton and felt very, very small. Because this is only one chapter. Join us as we leave the ground and follow the giant pterosaurs that turned the sky into their hunting field. Or dive with the marine reptiles that ruled the ancient seas before whales. We will trace the evolution of whales themselves, from wolf-sized shorewalkers to oceanic colossi. The Age of Giants did not end with the dinosaurs' extinction. It changed shape. And as long as we keep asking how such lives were possible, it never truly ends at all.